Hello and welcome to another Thursday Viking.TV interview with me, Anne Diamond. Now today I'm going back in history some 500 years to one of the most amazing historical stories and one of the best ever recent discoveries. Essentially, it was a missing persons case, looking for this man. It was a very cold case and a detective hunt where, frankly, the detectives themselves thought they had very, very little chance of finding anything. It's the story of the search and finding of the remains of the medieval king Richard III. Now, just in case you're not familiar with him and you haven't already sort of met him perhaps through Shakespeare, and of course that was written a long time ago, Richard III was the last Plantagenet king of England. That's before the Tudors took over. And there is Shakespeare's true tragedy of Richard III. Now, the man has always been painted in history as an evil hunchback, a villain with a withered arm. He killed the little princes in the Tower of London because they threatened his claim to the throne. And he was a thoroughly dastardly, dreadful person, killed in battle in 1485 and succeeded by Henry Tudor, who won the crown and became the first Tudor king. So in Richard III, the man, we're talking about a seriously dark, menacing character from history. He was, in fact, the last English monarch to die in battle, but his body had always been missing. Unbelievably, thanks to the dedication of enthusiasts all over the world and brilliant academics here in Britain, he was found. His body was actually discovered back in 2012, excavated, proved through DNA to be him, and then reburied with full royal honours just a few years ago. So 500 years after his death, and through a modern perspective, it suggests perhaps we've gotten the wrong impression of him. He may not have been the monster that Shakespeare described. After all, when you think of it, Shakespeare was actually writing 100 years later for a Tudor queen, Elizabeth I, the daughter of Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn. Now, it's a great play, we all know it is, but can we really now trust Shakespeare's version of his character? Well, my guest today will tell us, even to telling us about his hair and eye colour and what sort of diet he ate. But before I continue, this story is exciting and we are going to see the dig, which means we will be showing pictures of the skeleton and the skull and the scientific rigour to which it had to be subjected in the laboratory. That's just a little warning in case you're worried, but nothing, I promise, nothing most people would find disrespectful. So my special guest today has been key to the whole story of Richard III, from the council car park to the cathedral, and she bore the burden of proof through DNA. In an absolutely spellbinding moment, here we'll see she announces it to the world in this way. Now, just to remind you, she's comparing first the DNA of known descendants of Richard's family, and then comparing that to the DNA of the skeleton found at the dig.
Now, the first step here was to see if the DNA sequence from Michael matched that of the second line of descent. Here is the DNA sequence, or part of the DNA sequence, from Michael Ibsen. And this is that of the second lineage. As you can see, they did indeed match one another. So this verified the family tree as set out by Professor Kevin Schurer. The next step was to see if the DNA sequence from the skeletal remains matched with these individuals. And I can now tell you there is a DNA match between the maternal DNA from the descendants of the family of Richard III and the skeletal remains that we found at the Greyfriars Dig. In short, the DNA evidence points to these being the remains of Richard III.
That was a spine-tingling moment, because they had indeed found the body of King Richard III under a council car park in the English city of Leicester, which, if you don't know it, is in the East Midlands. So I am joined now by a geneticist, archaeologist, anthropologist and genealogist, Professor Turi King. Welcome.
Thank you for having me.
Oh, I just can't get over that moment. I mean, that was incredible. But that wasn't the first time you'd had that moment. When did you first experience personally that moment when you thought, wow, there's a match here?
So that was in December of 2012. So I had to go and do the ancient DNA research in two separate labs. You do it in two separate labs to make sure that if you've got any contamination going on, you shouldn't have the same one in both labs. So I was sitting with a very good friend of mine, Patricia Ballaresque, in the lab in Toulouse. It was just before Christmas 2012. And we had the first bit of DNA sequences coming back from the DNA from the skeletal remains. And I already had the DNA sequence from one of the living relatives. And there was a match for two segments. I knew I had a lot more to do, but just those two segments coming back exactly the same. And I have to say, I got up and did a little dance around the lab. It was one of those, oh my goodness, this.
I know, because I know so many, as I said, that so many of the professional team working on this project were very skeptical that they'd ever find anything, let alone a person. Were you similarly skeptical at first?
I think all of us were. So if you look at the day before the excavation started, what the media crew from the University of Leicester, well, loads of media crews turned up, but they went around and saying, do you think we'll find Richard III? So they asked members of the Richard III Society, such as Philippa Langley and John Ashdown Hill, and they're going, chance. And Philippa was going, well, if we do find him, if we don't find him, it's more about the looking for him. And we were all going, look, the chance of finding somebody, we're looking for sort of like a 1 meter by 2 meter grave in this kind of car park. What's the chances of coming right down on top of him? Which, of course, we did on the very first day.
I mean, it's just amazing. You mentioned Philippa Langley there, and there has been a movie now made about this, The Lost King, and it's all about her sort of, well, frankly, obsession. She was a member of the Richard III Society, and I know that there are societies all over the world, particularly in America, who helped her and sort of encouraged her on. How do you feel about Philippa Langley? I mean, did you work together on this very much?
Yeah, I mean, so we very much felt it was a partnership. So she, if you read her book, she talks about how she came to the University of Leicester in sort of spring 2011. And she approached Richard Buckley, who was the co-director of the University of Leicester Archaeological Services, ULAS, and Richard Taylor, who was our deputy registrar. And in that spring meeting, they say, yes, the university will put money in, you'll have our time. So they pledged my time for free, and all this kind of stuff. And then what happened was, so obviously the university has to do the stuff like get all of the permissions and all of that kind of stuff to be able to do anything, to write and get permission to excavate human remains and so on and so forth. And so what happened was Philippa was raising money for other bits. So the university had pledged money already. And then Philippa was raising money for other bits of it. And what happened was one of the donors pulled out, or they'd pledged 15,000 and then they said, oh no, we're only going to do 5,000. So she went out and raised money for this, to get the excavation going. So it was this really lovely partnership. So the Richard III Society put in money, the University of Leicester put in money, Leicester City Council put in money. There were quite a few people who put the money into the excavation bit. And then all of the post-excavation, because I mean, obviously you can do the excavation, but it means nothing unless you examine stuff. That was all paid for by the University of Leicester. So for me, I felt it was very much a partnership. So after that meeting in 2011, I got an email from Richard Buckley, because obviously this needs to be led by experts. So you've got Richard Buckley, who was leading the archaeology side, and really couldn't be a better person, because he's been excavating in downtown Leicester for 40 years. He'd actually done a map of medieval Leicester in 1987 based on previous maps, and he'd done a map, and so it showed where the friary was likely to be and all this kind of stuff. And then you need somebody to run the genetic side. So I got an email in 2011 saying, we're going to be doing this excavation. It's in downtown Leicester. We're going to be looking for the remains of somebody who's quite well known, who's supposed to be buried there, but I can't tell you who it is. And I wrote back going, is this Richard III? And because my aunt, when I first got to this country, so I'm from Canada, the first thing she did was she took me to the Bosworth battlefield where Richard III had been killed and let me books on him. And so I wrote back going, is this Richard? And he goes, yes, but don't tell anybody. Don't worry, we're never going to find him. So
Well,
so then
I find fascinating is that Philippa Langley's story is of her dream to try and find him. But of course, she knew it would take a team of people. And it was a multidisciplinary team because it had to involve, archaeologists, geneticists, history researchers, serious professionals like you. And I do find it quite fascinating that most of the science was in fact led by women.
It was. And so it's one of these slides that I've been doing since 2012 is that most of the science was led by women. So I led on the genetics side. You had Joe Appleby who led on the osteology. You've got people like Jane Evans who led on the stable isotope analysis. You've got Sarah Hainsworth who led on the forensics. So it was a really big and very mixed team. And that was the really good thing about it is because no one person could have done this on their own. It required lots of expertise from all different areas. And that's what the University of Leicester was able to bring to it because we have these experts here.
So where do you start? You've got to, first of all, look at the history. The history should be able to tell you where you might start looking. What did we already know about how Richard died and what was thought to have happened to his body?
So there's a lot of historical documentation about this, and it talks about how Richard is killed on the 22nd of August, 1485, at the Battle of Bosworth. And that's about 12 miles out of town. So we know then from the historical documentation that he's brought back and he's buried in the choir of the Church of the Greyfriars in Leicester. We know about this. There's a rumor that starts in around the early 17th century, a chap called John Speed. He's a cartographer, so he makes maps. And he writes this book and he talks about how Richard has been dug up during the dissolution of the monastery. So he's been dug up the fire and thrown in the local river. But there had been a lot of historical scholarship which had shown that this was unlikely to be true, and it starts very early on. But the kind of more modern period, so 1920, you have a chap called Bilson who's going, there's no reason to believe this is true. Richard probably lies in whatever's remaining of the Greyfriars Friary in Leicester. It was picked up by the Richard III Society in 1975. A chap here called David Baldwin wrote a paper in 1986, and it talks about how maybe in the future archaeologists will do an excavation and find the remains of Richard in what's left of the friary. If there's anything there, it's covered by a car park and buildings. And that got picked up by the press in the 90s. And then John Ashdown Hill, who was a member of the Richard III Society, then wrote about it. And I think it was this book which then led Philippa on going on this quest. But it had been known for a very, very long time that he was likely to be in wherever the friary used to be, and we knew where that was, or at least we knew where the friary precinct was, in this part of downtown Leicester, covered by a car park and buildings.
Now, there we're just seeing, obviously, a very old portrayal of Richard, the family man. He was, in fact, married, and he did have a son.
He did. Yeah. So he did. So, and this is the interesting thing about him, because obviously most people hear about it from Shakespeare. So Shakespeare calls him a bunchback toad and gives him a withered arm and a limp and really goes to town on him. But he's writing in the Tudor period. So that makes sense. But if you look at it and you look at contemporary records, there's talk about him. He seems to have been quite a good king. So he brings in various laws that's supposed to stop sort of counterfeiting of weights and things like this. So our view of Richard III has been largely formed by Shakespeare and less by looking at the contemporary texts.
Yeah, what brought him to Leicester in the first place? How come he and Henry Tudor were fighting over the crown, and why in Leicester?
Yeah, well, so Richard came to the throne in 1483 after his brother died, unexpectedly and quite young. So he comes to the throne, but then you have this chap called Henry Tudor who is around. He's descended from another line. So he and Richard are, they're distant cousins, but they're all descended from Edward III, essentially. So he decides that he is going to make a bid for the crown. He's in France. He comes to this country. He lands in Wales. And so he's making his way to London. And at the time, Richard is aware that Henry's going to invade, but doesn't know where. So he's actually up a little bit north of Leicester in Nottingham, which is about the centre of the country, waiting to kind of hear where Henry Tudor is going to land. So he hears that Henry's landed in Wales, and he starts to assemble his troops down here in Leicester. And then he's going to go out and try and meet Henry before he gets to London. So that's how he ends up assembling his troops in Leicester before going out and meeting him at the Bosworth battlefield.
Yeah, and I mean there are lots of reenactments of that. It's a very favourite of reenactors, isn't it? Which gives us a sort of flavour of what it would have looked like. But my goodness, what a bloody battle! So he's in Leicester to start with. He goes out to Bosworth Field for what they inevitably know will be a battle. He goes out looking victorious and very strong, but he comes back very differently. As you said earlier, his body stripped naked and flung over the back of a horse. What it reminds you just how awful and bloody these things were. It was a savage time, wasn't it?
Oh, it was really, and you can see that from the injuries on him. So he has 11 injuries on him. 9 of those are on his head. So you can see that at some point his helmet has come off, and he's got he's got various injuries on him. He's got one on his cheek, he's got one on his chin, he's got one on the top of his head. He's got what look like slice injuries on the top of his head. And this is where Sarah Hainsworth work came in, because she did micro CT scanning of the top of his head. And what she's interested in is looking at the striations caused by weapons. So each weapon has its own fingerprint. And she could see by looking at 3 of those slice injuries, it's looking at the same weapon. Probably a sword or a halberd, but the killer blows were 2 on the base of his skull. So that's showing us that Richard is probably on all fours at this point. And he had 7 centimeters of brain exposed, so a chunk is taken off the base of the skull. And then another one you can see where it's hit the top vertebrae, gone through the base of the skull and hit the skull on the other side. Either one of those 2 would have killed him, but we don't know which came first because they don't overlay one another. But then he has an injury on one of his ribs, and then he's got this one which Jo, when she was examining the remains, she's like, I don't know how he's managed to get this. It's on the inside of one of his bones of his pelvis. So what we did as part of the analysis was take his remains down to the Leicester Royal Infirmary to use their CT scanners. And that showed that from the angle, it must be a sword or a dagger that's gone up through the right buttock and up through the pelvis that way. So really, there's 2 ways that could have happened. One is in battle, because it's a part of the body that's not terribly well protected. But there is this record about him being stripped naked and, he's been thrown over the back of a horse. And that would present an opportunity for, it's talked about how humiliation injuries were heaped upon the body. And that would be a perfect opportunity for that to happen there. I mean, it's a brutal, brutal time. Yeah.
Is it unusual for you as an archaeologist and the rest of the team? I imagine when you're normally digging and you find skeletons and bodies, many of them are anonymous. You don't. But here, you clearly by now strongly suspected, as you look, that this was the man that we've all known about. Did it make it more personal and almost more awful?
It is. It's very well. It's the sort of thing that whatever skeleton you are dealing with, you are aware it's a human. It's a person. This person will have had parents, friends, siblings, this kind of thing. So I think at all times, you always feel that. But certainly there was a lot about the fact that this person is so well known. Well, I suppose some of it was also the pressure of working on the project, because the global scrutiny, the media scrutiny on what we were doing as well was also a factor that came into it. But yes, you're right. It's not something that you are normally involved in. And when we first found the remains, it was. So I missed a lot of this because I was helping Jo excavate on the 4th of September, and we'd done the legs and we'd gotten up to about sort of near the hip area. And then we thought, well, we need to finish this tomorrow. And I was going off to a forensics conference. So Jo finished this off, and you work from the outside in. So she had done the head and she could see injuries and they were perimortem. And she's going, okay, I'm not going to get let's just remain calm about this. Could be a friar who met a very nasty end. But then she was working her way from the pelvis and trying to go in a straight line up to where the skull was. And she was following the spinal column, and she realized she couldn't find some of the vertebrae. She starts going off to one side and she finds one. And then she finds another one. And she said the hair on the back of her neck, it goes up on my neck now.
Yeah,
the hair on the back of her neck.
Yeah,
because that's when
she
went.
Ahead yet, though.
Yeah.
Because we're still thinking, where do you even start?
Yes.
You had to look, first of all, you're looking for the old priory, because all of the evidence points to the fact that he was taken back and buried in the priory. Yeah. And being a high status person, even through the humiliation of just having lost that battle, they would have probably placed him the friars would have put him in a high status position in the friary. Which would be choir, we think.
That was recorded. So it was recorded that he was in the choir of the Church of the Grey Friars. So as archaeologists, our first thing is, okay, so now we need to find the Grey Friars. And we've got the Grey Friars precinct. We know from historical documentation that, and the way that friaries tend to work is they tend to be near main roads. So that starts to align us. So it's decided that what's going to happen is, if you put long, thin trenches running north-south, hopefully what you'll cross is main walls of friars which go east-west. And what we're hoping to do is, let's put 2 long, thin trenches down this main car park where we can excavate. Let's see if we can find any walls. And from that, we can start to generate a map as to where we actually are.
Yeah, so and to reiterate, an old religious building like that would have had east-west
walls.
So the best thing to do as an archaeologist is to dig your trenches that way. Yeah. So your chances of crossing those walls and then finding them.
That's right. Rather than running in between them, you run. So you try to cross them, and that's basically how it was decided how to do it. Do 2 staggered trenches in the hopes of hitting some of the main walls. And as it was, 6 hours and 34 minutes in, we hit a skeleton. But we don't know where we are at this point. So we've already got, we've put together a huge excavation plan in which we will excavate up to six sets of remains. But we have to be fairly intelligent about which ones we're going to go for, and ethically which ones we're going to go for. You don't just excavate skeletons kind of willy-nilly. You have to go, right, we know Richard's in the choir of the Church of the Grey Friars. We're going to wait until we know where we are, whether or not we're even inside the church or outside the church, so that we can make ethical decisions about which skeletons we're going to excavate. So we leave this one covered. Matthew Morris, who was our lead archaeologist, hops in and goes, yeah, there's a skeleton under there. We don't know where we are. We need to keep going. So over the next couple of weeks, as we're excavating, we realize that, okay, yeah, that does look like it's a skeleton that's in the choir. Let's go back and excavate that one. And that's how it came to be. But we'd actually found him on the very first day. We just didn't know. And he wasn't under the R. I know this is a really big thing.
Yeah, because just to remind everybody, it was a car park.
It was a car park.
In fact, don't you make the point that, quite interestingly, given what Richard was meant to have done to his nephews, it's a car park of a particular branch of social services.
It was child protection. So he's supposed to have murdered his nephews in order to be able to come to the throne, if this is the story. Yeah. And it was the council car park for child protection. You really could not make it up.
But the way the car park was painted in different bays, there was one bay with a big R on it.
That's right. And we were joking. The very first day, we were like, oh, he's bound to be under there. We'll just do a 1 meter by 1 meter test trench. We'll go straight down. He's going to be under there. He wasn't. So he was about a car parking bay and a half away from it, but I know it's a big deal. And I keep feeling like such a party pooper.
You also tell the story of how on the first day when the project was announced, all the press came, or the TV units with their satellite vans and whatever, and they'd literally parked all over exactly where ultimately
It's
the
true.
grave was found.
It's true. I took it, you know, we did the press conference on the day before the excavation started, and we thought, oh, I don't know, will anyone be interested? And they did. All the vans started turning up with their big satellite dishes, and I took photos of them because I thought, oh my goodness, it was quite a lot. And then it turned out to be kind of one of these ones where you go, oh my goodness, they'd parked right on top of the poor man. So yeah,
it's interesting because we've got one of the videos, and it's so brilliant that the uni filmed everything, quite rightly too, because there were some wonderful moments. Here is the project leader, Richard Buckley, lots of Richards in this as well, and he's explaining how and where they decided to start digging. Let's have a look at this.
The choir is of particular interest to us because of this historical account that suggests that Richard III was actually buried in the choir. So in terms of our search for Richard III, to actually have identified what we think may be part of the choir is a really major breakthrough. We've already had a pretty good breakthrough finding the church, but to actually find the choir as well is quite something. And as we were discussing that, a burial was being exhumed by Dr. Jo Appleby. She's a human osteologist. We thought we ought to excavate that burial because it had been revealed during the initial machining of the trench and then very carefully covered up because we weren't sure exactly whereabouts it was in relation to all the friary buildings. So as she was excavating that burial, she was coming to the conclusion that this burial could well be the one we were looking for.
I mean, you must have all been in shock that it was the first set of bones that you found that turned out to be the skeleton.
Yeah.
The whole thing is, rhymed with coincidence, isn't it?
It is. I mean, that ended up being skeleton 1. That was the first of the 6 that we started to excavate. And what had happened was I had gone off to a forensics conference in Innsbruck, and I texted Joe because I had been joking the day before, I won't miss anything whilst I'm away. That's going to be a 90-year-old friar who lived a nice long life and died in his bed. So I was having a little bit of a joke. And I texted Joe when I landed and I said, how's our 90-year-old friar? And she texted back going, youngish male, head injuries, hunchback, because he's in the ground. She can't tell it's a sideways curve yet. So I was like, are you kidding? So I rang Matthew, who I knew would be at the side of the trench, our site director. And he's like, yeah, it's looking like it. And then the next thing I did was I rang Philippa because I knew what a big deal this would be for her, and said, are you okay? And you could really tell she was in shock. I think she was just, I mean, you can imagine this has been something that she's been wanting to do. Even she, on the day before the excavation, is skeptical as to whether or not we're going to find him. And then here it is. We're uncovering somebody who looks like it could be him.
Well, let's go back to the video because this is Richard Buckley takes up the story again of how Joe is excavating that, particularly the spinal cord. Let's have a look at this.
The remains that Joe was uncovering was actually in an area that was rather unprepossessing, I have to say. It was very badly disturbed by adjacent Victorian foundations, just a matter of a few centimetres away. There were no floor levels to speak of surviving, just this skeleton. But then as Joe excavated it, she discovered that the spine had some quite significant curvature to it. I think she originally thought maybe it was just the remains were placed in the ground, but as it turned out, it was actually a definite curvature of the spine. She also looked at the skull and found evidence for trauma on the skull, consistent with somebody who'd been killed in battle.
It's the fact that you found that body, and the likelihood of it not being Richard actually becomes smaller and smaller, doesn't it? Because you're seeing somebody who fits the bill straight away. Yeah.
So this is the thing. I mean, everything's pointing to it being him. So we do radiocarbon dating, that comes back as right. We do things like where we're just looking at the remains. It's about the right age. He's got battle injuries. He's in the right part of the friary. Stable isotope is coming back as this individual is a high status individual. And then obviously what you can do is you can add DNA evidence to the pot these days, and that's where I came in. So that is comparing the DNA from the remains with known living relatives. So that took work.
Did you come back immediately from Innsbruck? Did you have to come back and do that?
So I stayed the rest of the conference, which wasn't very long. But here I'm surrounded by colleagues and friends who are some of the most amazing forensic scientists in the world. I can't say anything. So I fly back, and I'm extracting teeth to take away to do DNA analysis very quietly, and we're keeping it all under wraps because obviously we want to do a proper announcement, and Philippa's there and the team is there, and we're all talking about how we found these remains and we need to do this analysis now.
As we look, we'll look once more, and again, it's a warning to anyone watching if you are a bit upset. We are going to be looking more at the skeleton and of that amazing curved spine and of that very injured skull. So please be warned, but it's all done with the utmost honour, I think, and respect, but scientific analysis. As we look at it, Turi, the curve in the spine must have been a shock for everybody, because those people who we're seeing here, aren't we? You're removing a tooth. That's how you find ancient DNA, is it?
Yeah, well, so you go for, there's certain parts of the body that are better for preserving DNA. So whilst we're alive, we've got nice long strands of DNA, and you do have things that come along and break it up, but your body just knits it back together for you. After death, that's not happening anymore. So the DNA starts to break down into shorter and shorter fragments of DNA until there's nothing left at all to analyze. But in terms of parts of the body which are going to be better have the best chance of having DNA in there, that's usable, is teeth. Teeth are one of the best ones to go for. So really nerve-wracking, because I can't just use a set of pliers. I've got to just wiggle this tooth back and forth until it finally comes out to take away for analysis.
I can't get over that shot of you holding Richard III's tooth.
I know. Believe me, the enormity of what you're doing, it's very surreal, and you're so nervous, as you are with any ancient remains, that you don't want to do any damage that is unnecessary. So all the time you're trying to work with a minimum amount of sample to be able to carry out the work that you want to do. So yeah, it was really nerve-wracking whilst you're working on these remains, because you can't, you have to work with the utmost kind of caution and make sure that you're not ever doing anything to contaminate it and this kind of thing. So it's pressure.
The discovery of the curve in the spine must have been shocking in so many ways, because for so many centuries we have always understood him to be a hunchback, Shakespeare's idea, and then the Richard III Society, I know, have long thought that's probably not true. There was always this idea that if you wanted to portray somebody as slightly evil, you portrayed them as somebody who was disabled in some way. And then for you to actually find a skeleton with a curvature of the spine is just mind-boggling for everybody. It must have been shocking for everybody.
Well, so we've been looking at the contemporary sources, of which there are two that talk about his appearance. So one doesn't mention anything about that, but one of them, the Rouse Roll, talks about how Richard has one shoulder higher than the other. So going into the excavation, we were aware that might be something we're looking for. But I know that there are sort of segments of the Richard III Society who thought, well, no, that's propaganda. It's not true. This was a contemporary source, though. But we were trying to keep an open mind about it, because there is this contemporary source which talks about him having one shoulder higher than the other. Yeah.
But from what we know now, because you've done so much analysis, it was scoliosis, if that's what it's called.
Yes.
But it wouldn't have necessarily rendered him as a hunchback in any way at all.
No, so that's the thing. So kyphosis is hunchback. Scoliosis is a sideways curve of the spine. He's got very slight kyphosis. It does have a slight little kind of angle to it. It's a sideways curve. And he would have been, so people are kind of go, but how could he have been, he was fighting in battle. And it's interesting, there was a chap called Dominic Smee, who is, reenactors at the Bosworth battlefield. His mum is one of those. And he came along to the excavation, and there was a television company doing a kind of a thing around him. And they had armor made specifically for him. He had nearly identical scoliosis to Richard. And he said the armor was fantastic because it kept him upright. And I have to say, when I first met him, he was on the dig site. He had a jacket on, a high-vis jacket, and I had no idea. Yeah.
No, I've seen that I've seen so many documentaries.
Yeah.
The evidence also, the historical evidence suggests that he was quite small, slim, slender, almost of, I don't know, just a sort of, not frail, because he went into battle.
It's called gracile. So this was an interesting thing because Jo, when she was first looking at the skeleton, so obviously, men and women are on a spectrum in terms of robusticity. Yeah. And when she was first looking at the skeleton, she's like, he's quite, not female, but very gracile. And there was at one point, she's like, have I got this wrong? Is it a male? There's various bits of the skeleton that you look at to sex a skeleton, but it's on a gradient. So the first thing I actually did for her was that thing in Toulouse where I did a quick check to see if it was a boy. I said, look, I'll check with the DNA. I'll tell you whether or not it's a boy or not. So just before Christmas 2012, I texted her with, it's a boy, just so she would know what that meant.
Yeah. But he was slight, but clearly a very able horseman, again, according to all accounts. And don't the historical accounts also say he fought incredibly bravely in that battle?
He did, and in other battles. So he's also known to be quite a keen dancer. Oh. So I know, and I think, isn't that a lovely thing to know? So it's not holding him back. It might have done so had he, as he was getting older, it would have gotten that bit worse. He probably would have had trouble, breathing because one of the lungs would start to be a little bit crushed. So it would have gotten worse as he got older, but he seems to have been quite an energetic young man. He was only 32.
We've got some more video of the whole team examining the skull, particularly here, articulating it and talking about the various wounds that he went through in that terrible battle. And of course, I mean, yes, by now all of you feel this must be Richard. He ticks every box of which you were looking for and more. But you have to prove it through DNA, don't? That falls to you. What a burden.
Well, it was, so I always say, look, the DNA is just one of the strands of evidence because you have to take all of the strands of evidence together. But yes, there did feel like a certain amount of pressure on it. And it was a case of, first of all, being able to extract DNA from the skeleton. Is it even usable? And it was. And then comparing that with known relatives of Richard III. So Richard left no known living descendants. And because of the way our DNA is inherited, not just any old relative is going to do. So the vast majority of our DNA is a very complex mixture of many of our ancestors. But there's two pieces of DNA that are passed down through the generations in a really simple way. Just they're virtually unchanged as they come down through the generations. And one of those is mitochondrial DNA. So that's a small circular piece of DNA. It's in the egg. So all of us girls, we pass it on to all of our children, but boys can't pass it on. Oh. But Richard's mum, Cecily, had a daughter who had a daughter who had a daughter down through the generations. There was one actually, then they have two daughters. So we were able to trace two living female line descendants. So one had already been traced. So that was by looking at the Ruveny roll. So a huge part of that family tree was already done. And then John Ashdown Hill and a team were able to take it down that bit further to find a chap called Michael Ibsen, who was Canadian like me, but living in London. And then the team here at Leicester then found another individual who is 14th cousins twice removed from Michael through the female line. So they share several generations back. There were two sisters. And her name was Wendy Duldig. And I love her surname Duldig because it wasn't anything, it was not a Duldig that we were on. But she also agreed to take a DNA test. So then I'm looking to see if their mitochondrial DNA types match each other, and does that match the skeleton? And that was that first thing that you showed.
Yeah. So you have to. You've gone back all of these right back to Richard's mother through the maternal lines. Luckily, there was a clean maternal line, and you found two living relatives on that line. So they've got the mitochondrial DNA. So first, you've got to prove that they're similar. And then if they are, and they were, that they also have that they match Richard's skeleton.
Yeah.
And
so if they match the skeleton, that's again another strong piece of evidence that these are the remains of Richard. So then what you do is what's known as a Bayesian statistical analysis. So this is where, I mean, I was really lucky because with a project like this, I can go to the best and go, I need your help. And so they did the stats on this, and they showed that it's a 99.99999% probability that these are remains of Richard III.
Yeah. Because when you're looking at it, you were looking in the place that he should have been in. You're looking for a young man between some 24 and 30, was it?
Yeah. So we know he's age 32. And it's coming back as 30 to 35. So you can tell by the sutures and teeth and stuff like that. So you're right. So we're looking for a male, the right age, in the right place. Radiocarbon dates come back right. The stable isotope data was showing that this was a high status individual, but the whole time we're doing this, we're trying to bias it towards it not being Richard. We're being super conservative. And if you say, well, this person's got a high status diet, but he's buried in a high status part of the church, then that is circular. So it's biasing the results towards it being Richard. So we removed that. We did analysis of the Y chromosome, so looking at male line relatives, and that didn't match, but you just include that in the calculations, and then you get this match on the female line. And even with all of that together, being as conservative as possible, what you're calculating is what's known as a likelihood ratio. So what is the likelihood that this is somebody who purely by chance fits everything we know about Richard, but it's not Richard? So that came back as 6.7 million to 1.
Yeah, because you're looking for including battle injuries, and the right time that he would have been buried there. Everything matched. So along with DNA, how could it not be Richard, I guess? I know that you're a fan of nominative determinism, because you mentioned there Wendy Duldig, one of the living descendants of the family, and it was anything but a dull dig. But also, you're the sort of poster girl for nominative determinism because of your name.
I know. So it's quite sweet. My dad spotted this and sent it to me. So there's a chap who believes in nominative determinism. So what your name is determines what you become. So he had various examples like William Headline. And so Turi King, Turi King. I know. And the number of people who've said to me, your name is King. Of course you were meant to work on this program, on this project.
You were. Yeah. You can even, talking about the DNA, what you were able to tell, you can even tell the colour of Richard's eyes and hair. And so you've been looking at the way he was portrayed in the portraits that we've come to know, which were painted long after his death. What do you think he would have looked like?
Well, so there's two that vie for being the earliest. So there's no portraits of Richard from his lifetime. They're all painted about 25 to 30 years after his death. So there's the two that are the earliest. There's one's in the Royal Collection. He's got very dark hair and dark eyes. And then there's one in the Society of Antiquaries known as the Arched Frame Portrait. And he's got lighter color hair and lighter color eyes, like quite light blue eyes. So there are bits of our DNA that we know code for hair and eye color, pigmentation generally. And what we did was we looked at some of those and we used that to predict what his hair and eye color were. And it's coming back as 96% chance of being blue eyes and a 77% chance of having blonde hair, but that's childhood hair color. And we know lots of people get this and their hair darkens as they get older. So when you look at those two portraits and you go, okay, which most closely matches what we know from the DNA? It's the Arched Frame Portrait from the Society of Antiquaries.
Yeah. So he wasn't quite, and it's interesting in that he has got slight hands, hasn't he? They're not chunky male hands. There's a slight frame suggested there in his hands.
It is. Yeah, and you could see that from the skeletal remains. So he was coming back as quite gracile. Yeah.
Gracile.
That fits.
It's interesting. I mean, we non-scientists are fascinated by DNA and what it can tell us. And there are rumours going around that apparently we're all related to Richard III.
We are.
How?
Okay. So, first of all, we're all related to one another because we're all part of the human species. But There's been some recent work done where it's shown that pretty much everybody is descended from Edward III. If you've got broadly British ancestry, then you will be a descendant of royalty. And we can work that out really quite easily. So Edward III, he had several children. We know that he had over 320 great grandchildren. So we go, okay, so we know that population growth is happening, and we know that royal families tended to have more children. So we can work out that by 1600 AD, there would have been over 20,000 people alive who would have been his descendants. So that's about 1 in 200 people who were alive in 1600 were direct descendants from Edward III, probably would not have even known it. So then if you work back and you go, okay, well, if you work back to that generation, you've got 2 parents, 4 grandparents, 8 great-grandparents. If you work back to 1600, at that point in time, you would have had over 32,000, 13 times great-grandparents. So the chances of one of those 13,000 being one of those 1 in 200 is very, very high. In fact, the chances of one of your great-great-great whatever grandparents not being one of those 1 in 200 people wandering around is remote. So we are all, if you've got broadly British ancestry, we are descended from Edward III.
And you would be able to prove that.
Well, so DNA, you can only do it if it's through those 2 lines, mitochondrial DNA or the Y chromosome. Here's where you need really good, well-documented genealogies. So if you can go back, and they're called gateway ancestors. So if you start going back in your family tree, start to see if there's any of them who are linking into clergy, farmers owning lots of land, because often, so you've got the royal families, the eldest born son, they become the heir. But the younger children, they get married off into society, they might be merchants, they might go into clergy, this kind of thing. So if you start finding these sorts of people in your family tree, start having a good look, because you may find that they link you back into the royal family tree.
My goodness.
Yeah.
That is just mind-blowing. I know that luckily, because you were at the University of Leicester, which has become so well known for its work with DNA, you worked with, or at least alongside, I think at one point, Professor Jeffries.
Yes. So
invented DNA fingerprinting.
He did. He was on my PhD panel. So I was incredibly lucky. I did my degree in archaeology and anthropology at Cambridge, and I got really interested in how you can use genetics to answer questions in history and archaeology. And all my tutors said, don't stay at Cambridge, go to Leicester. So I ended up with Professor Sir Alec Jeffreys on my PhD panel. I was one of his last PhD students before he retired. Yeah.
That was an amazing piece of work. You've also looked at Viking DNA. Now, of course, that interests us at Viking.
Yeah.
But yeah, you've been able to sort of look at the way Viking DNA has spread throughout Europe.
Yeah, so
America?
I ended up doing sampling in Norway, because we know the Vikings arrived in this country in sort of the 8th, 9th, 10th century. Could we see the signature of that still in people who are alive today? And this is where I was looking at the Y chromosome, which comes down, a man gets it from his father, who gets it from his father, going back through time. So you would have had men and women. We know that they were family groups coming over and settling here. If you look among the men in areas where we know the Vikings got to, do you see Y chromosome types that look like they originate in Norway? And you do. So it's fascinating stuff. I would get people who would call me up and go, I think I'm a Viking. And can I take a DNA test? Yeah. I thought it was quite sweet, because I am a Viking, and obviously Vikings were around about 1,000 years ago, but it's quite, but being able to look at people's DNA and saying, yes, you've got a Y chromosome type that's found at high frequency in Norway, doesn't mean that your ancestor came over as part of the Viking migration, because it could have been through another route, but you do find them at higher levels in parts of the country where we know the Vikings got to.
It is fascinating, because up until now, we've always been able to trace how people moved and lived in the past through what they left behind, buildings and things like that. But even more amazing is what they left behind through their DNA. And you're able to look at that.
Yeah, I mean, it's fascinating. These days, obviously, now what we do is we go to the skeletons themselves and we look at these ancient remains and we look at the DNA from them. There was a really interesting Viking study that was done about a year or so ago where they actually found family members, one in Denmark and one here. So these were probably uncle, nephew. I mean, amazing what you can do with DNA now, and shows you just how far these families spread and traveled.
Do you ever pinch yourself and think, I was so lucky to be part of that
Yes.
project?
Yes.
And
Oh my
what's
goodness.
working on at the moment?
So I'm working on a television program called DNA Family Secrets, and this actually follows on some of the work I did for my PhD. Basically, it's where people come to us and they say, I was adopted, or I'm a foundling, or I was donor conceived, or you get people who take these DNA tests and they find out that actually they're not full siblings with their siblings, this kind of thing. So we then use DNA to track down their donor parent or their adoptive parents or this kind of thing. It's incredibly emotional to film. Yeah. Oh my goodness, I can't even tell you how emotional it is. They're in tears. I'm often in tears. You hear the camera crew sniffing. It's incredibly, oh my goodness, it's heartwarming and often bittersweet. And I just feel ridiculously privileged to be part of it.
What an amazing job you're in.
I know.
Fascinating.
I'm so lucky.
But you talk about it being emotional, dealing with the living people on your present program, but it was emotional finding Richard, wasn't it?
Oh my goodness, hugely.
Every time I watch any of the movies about it or the documentaries, I get very upset. And yet he's always been a vilified figure. No, but he was a human being, and you were able to find him and identify him and give him a royal burial in the end. There he is in Leicester still.
Absolutely. I think one of the things I really loved about it was that it brought so many people together to work on this amazing project. No one person could have done it on their own. It took a real team of people, dedicated people, to work on it. And I think it was just such a wonderful project.
And from your point of view, doing the DNA analysis, going through what we the maternal lines, you wouldn't have been able to do that later, because don't those two lines end now?
They do, yes.
Because
so
Michael Ibsen is a man, so he can't pass it on.
He has a sister who's past childbearing age. She hasn't had children.
Oh.
Wendy, also past childbearing age, not had any children.
So you wouldn't have been able to do that proof in 50 years' time.
It's like we had this little window to do it in. Yeah.
Wow.
Amazing.
Well, look, it's been absolutely fascinating talking to you. I could talk to you about it forever and ever, but it's absolutely brilliant, and what an amazing achievement, and for all the team as well. Thank you so much. No. And it's so good of you to give up your time to tell us all about it.
No, such a pleasure. Thank you.
Yeah, great. Thank you. So for the moment, I suppose we can leave Richard III, now regally entombed in Leicester Cathedral. And if you ever get the chance to go there, you will want to go visit both the cathedral where he is now and the visitors centre, which is on the very spot where he was found, the King under the car park. Until I'm with you again. Goodbye.
Well, what we set out to do with this centre is to tell the story of Richard, the story of his period, the story of his death at Bosworth.
And then we move on 500 years and tell the story of the dig, his discovery, and then his identification as well. And then the visit will finish with a visit to the gravesite itself where he was found.
What we've got here is something that far exceeds any of my hopes and expectations. We've got some astonishingly imaginative work done by some very creative people who have used modern technology to take the history and to treat it very faithfully, but to treat it in a way that is accessible by us in the 21st century.
My first impressions of the visitor centre are a wow. This is a really great facility for the city. And I think one of the things I'm particularly impressed about is the way in which they have told the story not just of Richard and the Wars of the Roses, but also of the forensic investigation, if you like, into the skeleton and the archaeology surrounding it. And actually displayed that in a way that makes sense to the non-scientist. I think it's absolutely wonderful.
I think when the public come to see the visitor centre, they'll get a real sense of Leicester's archaeology and often how hard-won it can be. Most of the things we do in Leicester are in connection with development, so some very deep and complex archaeological sites are excavated all over the place in the city. When people come here, they will actually see how difficult it can be to interpret these very intangible remains.
There's some things in particular. I think the skeletal remains, being able to see this 3D reconstruction of the skeletal remains, I think is going to be really, really interesting. I know that's something my kids are going to be interested in seeing. And they've got the dig diary, which basically shows about how the whole process went on for all of us, and I think that's a really nice piece of work for people to see the work that we did.
This is a centre for everybody, of all ages, whether they be children, whether they be grandparents. There's so much to learn about Richard III, his family, the times, the Wars of the Roses, as well as the archaeology and the science that lay behind the evidencing. As one of the academics involved in the project, to a certain extent, we thought that our work, in a sense, ended with the scientific results. And to see the work that we did captured in this way, which is therefore accessible to so many more people and will live on for years and years, I just think is absolutely fantastic.
It's been a huge amount of work for everybody involved in the project, so to see all of it being brought together as the visitor centre, it's really rewarding.
But will also be something that has a sustainable future, and it will continue to tell the story of Richard and the story of Leicester, not just for months to come, but for decades to come.